And we continue with The Dark Frigate. Chapter 7. The Ship's Liar. Death by land is a sobering thing, and works many changes, but to my thought death at sea is more terrible, for there is a vast loneliness, with only a single ship in the midst of it, and an empty hammock for days and weeks, and even months, to keep a man in mind of what has happened. And death at sea may work as many changes as death by land. Now the Rose of Devon was a week from England, when a foot rope parted and the boatswain pitched down, clutching at the great belly of the sail, and plunged out of sight. And what could a man do to save him? They never saw him after that first wild plunge. There, aloft from the parted rope, its ends frayed out and hanging. Below decks was the empty berth. The blustering old boatswain, with its great roaring voice and its quick ear for a tune, had gone upon the ultimate adventure, which all must face, each man for himself. But they only said, "Did you see the wild look in his eyes when he fell? And I fear we shall hear his pipe of nights." And 'tis an odd thought that Neddy Hart is to lie in old Davy Jones's palace, with the odd sea women all about him, awaiting for his old shipmates. Presently the master's boy came forward into the forecastle, where the men off duty were sitting and talking of the one who had fallen so far, had sunk so deep, had gone on a journey so long that they should never see him again. And quietly, for the boy as much bedeviled and trembled with fright, to think of putting his head, as it were, into the mouth of the lion, he crept behind Philip Marsham and whispered in his ear, "The master would see thee in the great cabin." They sat at the close quarters in the forecastle of the Rose of Devon, and the boy had barely room to pass the table and the benches, for the men had crowded in and put their heads together. But for once they were too inert on their own thoughts to heed his coming or his going, which gave him vast comfort. Little enough comfort the poor devil got, between the men forward and the officers aft. So Phil rose and followed. The great cabin, when he entered, was empty. He stood at loss, waiting, but curiously observed, meanwhile, the rich hangings and the deep chairs, the cupboards filled with porcelain ware. There was a plate on the cabinet table, and a rich cloak lay thrown loosely over a chair. And he thought to himself that those deep sea captains lived like princes, as indeed they did. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other in growing uneasiness. The boy had disappeared. There was no sound of voice or step. Then, as the ship rolled and Phil put out his foot to brace himself, a door swung open and revealed an old-fashioned walk that ran across the stern under the poop, the lean, big-boned figure of Captain Francis Candle. The master of the Rose of Devon stood with folded arms and bent head. But though his head was bent, his eyes, the lad could see, were peering from under his heavy brows at the horizon. He swayed as the ship rolled, and remained intent on his thoughts, which so absorbed him that he had quite forgotten sending the boy for Philip Marsham. So Phil waited, and the broad hat that hung on the bulkhead scraped backward and forward as the ship plunged into the trough and rose on the swell. Captain Candle remained intent on his thoughts, and a sea-bird circled over the wake of the ship. After a long time the master turned about and walked into the cabin, and, there espying Philip Marsham, he smiled and said, "I was remiss, I had forgotten you." He threw aside the cloak that lay on the chair and sat down. "Sit ye down," he said with a nod. "You are a practised seaman, no lame, decrepit fellow who serves for under wages. Have you mastered the theory?" "Why, sir, I am not unacquainted with astrolabe and quadrant, and, 'on scales and tables,' I have spent much labor." "So! and his manner showed surprise. Then ink-pot and quill are before you. Choose a fair sheet, and put down thereon the problem I shall set ye. The captain leaned back, and half closed his eyes, while Phil spread the paper and dipped the quill. Let us say, he finally continued, that two ships sail from one port. The first sails south-southwest a certain distance, and then altering her course, she sails due west 92 leagues. The second ship, having sailed 60 leagues, meets with the first ship. I demand the second ship's course, and Rome, and how many leagues the first ship sailed south-southwest. Now, my men, how go ye to work? Phil studied the problem, as he had set it down, and wrinkled his brows over it, while Captain Candle lay back with a flicker of a smile on his lips and watched the lad struggle with his thoughts. After a time Phil raised his head. "First, sir," said he, "I shall draw the first ship's robe thus, from A unto E, which shall be south-southwest. Then I shall lay a line from A unto C, as the 90 leagues that she sailed west. Next I shall lay my line from C to D, and further as her southwest course. Then I shall lay from A a line that shall correspond to the 60 leagues the second ship sailed, which cuts at D the line I drew before." As he talked, he worked with his pen, and the master, rising as if in surprise, bent over the table and watched every motion. The pen drew lines and arcs, and lettered them, and wrote out a problem in proportions. Hesitating, the point crawled over columns of figures. "The Rome of the second ship," said Phil at last, "is degrees 67, and minutes 36. Her course is near west-southwest, and the first ship sailed 49 leagues. Tapping the table as one does who meditates, Captain Candle looked more sharply at the lad. "You are clever with your pen." "'Tis owing to the good Dr. Arbour at Roehampton," Phil replied. "Had I abode with him longer, I had been cleverer still, for he was an able scholar. But there was much in school I had not taste for." The captain's eyes searched his face. "I sent for you," he said, "because I was minded to make you my boatswain. But now, if my mate were lost, I swear I'd set ye at mine own table." Phil rose. "Go then, master boatswain. But stay. You and your camarado make a strange pair. How came ye bedfellows?" "Why, sir, we met upon the road." "Yea, not at sea, not at sea. Enough is said. Begone, master boatswain, begone." "How now," cried Martin when Phil passed him on the deck, "art thou called before the mast?" And he laughed till he shook. "Nay, he hath made me his boatswain." "Thou? Ye camarado? Thou? A mere gooseling? The master's on the road to Bedlam?" "Why, here I am." Martin's red face flamed hot. "Yea, he spoke of thee." "Aye." "Quoth he thou art a fine fellow, but hot-tempered, Martin, and overbold." "Ah!" The crafty, sly look came upon Martin's face, and he puffed with pride. But Phil, delighting to see the jest take effect, laughed before his eyes, which sorely perplexed him. "A fine fellow, but overbold," Martin muttered, as he coiled the cable in neat fakes. "Yea, I did not believe he thought so well of me, from the glances he hath bestowed upon me. It was in my mind he was a narrow man." Martin smiled and dallied over his work, one with no eye for a mariner of parts and skill. "A fine fellow, but overbold." "Nay, that is fair speech, and it seems he hath a very searching observation." Standing erect, Martin folded his arms and swelled like a turkey-cock, his eyes being on the horizon and his back towards the watchful mate. He remained unaware that he had attracted the mate's attention. "A fine fellow, but overbold," he repeated, and smiled with a very haughty air. The mate, casting his eyes about the deck, picked up a handy end of the rope, and made a knot with it. One man and another became aware of the play that the mate and Martin were about to set, and grinning hugely, they paused in their work to watch, even though they risked getting themselves into such a plight as Martin's. The captain came to the break of the quarter-deck, and perceiving the fun afoot, leaned on the swivel-gun. Slowly his humor mastered his dignity, and a smile twitched on his lips. "A fine fellow, but overbold," Martin was murmuring for the fourth time, when the rope whistled and wound about his ribs, and the knot fetched up on his belly with a thump that knocked the wind clean out of him. He made a horrible face, gasping for breath, and his ruddy color darkened to purple. Reaching for his knife, he whirled round and drew steel. "What muckworm! What base stinkard! What—" He met the cold eye of the mate, and for a moment flinched. Then, burning with his own folly, he cried, "Thou villain, to strike thus a man the captain himself called a fine fellow, but overbold!" A snicker grew in the silence and swelled into a rumble of laughter. Then by the forecastle bulkhead a man began to bawl, "A liar! A liar!" The mate stopped short, and his hand fell. A score of voices took up the cry, "A liar! A liar!" and Martin turned pale. Captain Candle on the quarter-deck was laughing softly, and the mate in glee slapped his thigh. "Thou yarking, frisking, jerking tinker," said he, "dost hear the cry? 'Tis a Monday morning, and they are crying thee at the mainmast. A liar, a liar!" the men bawled, crowding close about. "But 'tis no lie, or this foully deceitful camarado, this half-fledged boatswain." It came suddenly upon Martin that he had been sorely gulled, and that to reveal the truth would fix upon him the lasting ridicule of his shipmates. He swelled in fury and gave them angry glances, but they only laughed the louder. Then, rope in hand, the mate stepped toward him. Though he made a motion as if to stand his ground, at sight of the rope, Martin's hand shook in his haste to thrust his knife back into the sheath. It was the old custom of the sea that they should hail as a liar the man first caught in a lie on a Monday morning, and proclaim him thus from the mainmast. And unhappy was the man thus hauled, for thereby he became for a week the ship's liar, and held his place under the swabber. "For 7 days, thou old cozener," said the mate, "thou shalt keep clean the beakhead and the chains, and lucky art thou to be at sea. Ashore they would have whipped thee through the streets at the cart's tail." Again a great wave of laughter swept the deck, and by his face Martin showed his anger. But though he was a fine fellow and overbold, he kept his tongue between his teeth, and whatever he suspected of Philip Marsham, he held his peace and went over the bow with ill grace, and fell to scraping the chains, which was a task to humble the tallest pride. There was that in the laughter of the crew which had taught discretion to even bolder men than Martin Barwick. "I have seen his kind before," a voice said, low in Philip's ear. "But though there be much of the calf in him, beware lest you rouse him to such a pitch that he will draw and strike." It was Will Canty, the youth who had already won the young boatswain's liking, spoke thus. He was a camarado more to Philip's taste than was the luckless Martin. But fate is not giving to consulting tastes, and necessity forces upon a traveler such bedfellows as he meets by the way. Chapter 8. Storm. The storm brewed long in grey banks of cloud that hung in the west and north. It drew round the Rose of Devon from north to east with a slow, immutable force, as yet perceived rather than felt. Still she sailed in the midst of a circle of haze. At night the moon was ringed, the sun rose in a bank of flaming red, and the small sea-birds that by their presence, mariners say, tell of the coming gales, played over the wake. Captain Candle from the poop sniffed at the damp air, and studying the winds as they veered and rose in brisk flourishes and fell to the merest whisper of a breeze. He puckered his lips, which was his way when he thoughts crowded upon him. Martin on the beakhead pursued his noisome task of cleaning it under the watchful eye of the swabber, who took unkind joy in exacting from him the utmost pains, and cast furtive glances at the grey swell that came shouldering up from the east. "Hola, boatswain!" the captain cried. "Yea, yea, our foresail is old, and hath lost its goodness. Look to thy stores, and see if there be not another. Have it ready, then, to bend in haste, if there be need. Yea, yea, and lay out thy cordage, boatswain, that if sheet or halyard or tackling shall part, we may be ready to bend another in its place." Descending thereupon into the forehold, with its boatswain's mate to fetch and carry, Boatswain Marsham fell to work overhauling the bolts of sailcloth and the hanks of cordage and the coils of rope, till he had found a new foresail and laid it under the hatch, and had placed great ropes and such cordage as headlines and marlins and sannets, so that a man could lay hands on them in a time of haste and confusion. For the Rose of Devon was heavily pitching, and the seas crashed on their 3-inch planks with a noise like thunderclaps. And when she lifted on the swell, and the water rumbled against her bilge, and gurgled away past her run. Very faintly he heard a sailor's voice. "The pump is choked." There was a shouting above for a time, and then the cry arose, which brought reassurance to all. "Now she sucks," and again there was quiet. Climbing through the hatch and passing aft along the main deck, he heard for himself the suck-suck from the pump well, and then the rattle of till and creak of pintle as the helmsman eased her off and brought her on to meet a rising sea. "Hola, master! Hola, is all laid ready below?" "Yea, ropes and cordage and sail are laid ready upon the main deck and secured against the storm." "And seemeth she staunch to one in the hold?" "Yea, master." "Then, boatswain, call up the men to prayer and breakfast, for we shall doubtless have need of both ere the day is done. Boy, fetch my cellar of bottles, for I would drink a health to all, fore and aft, and I would have the men served out each a little sack." By midday the veering winds had settled in the east, and the overcast sky had still further darkened. The ship, laboring heavily, held her course, but as the wind blew up a fresh gale, the after sails took the wind from the sails forward, which began to beat and thrash. Swarming aloft, the younkers handed the fore topsails steering sail, the fore and main topsails, and the main topsails stay sail. But as they manned the foreyard, the ship yawned in such a manner that the full force of the wind struck the old foresail and split it under their fingers. Philip Marsham on the weather yard arm, with the grey seas breaking in foam beneath him at one minute, and with the forecastle itself seeming to rise up at him the next minute, so heavily did the old ship roll, was reaching for the sail, At the moment it tore to ribbands, and billow of grey canvas striking him in the face, knocking him off the yard. But as he fell, he locked his legs round the spar and got finger hold on the earing, and crawled back to the mast as the sailors stood by the ropes to strike the yard and get in the thrashing tatters of the sail. The mate going aft was caught in the waist when the ship gave a mighty lurch and went tumbling to leeward, where the scupper holes were spouting like so many fountains all a row. The fall might well have ended his days. He had not bumped into the capstan, where he clung fast with both arms, and twice lucky he was to stay his fall thus. For a sea came roaring over the waist, and drowned the fountains in the scuppers, and in a trice the decks were awash from forecastle to poop. But the old ship shook her head and righted. The captain, Francis Candle, leaning against the wind, his cloak flapping in the gale and his hat hauled hard down over his eyes, descended from the poop and braced himself in its lee. "The wind blows friskly," the mate cried, scrambling up the ladder and joining the master. "Yea, it is like to overblow." She took a shrewd plunge but now. "We shall further our voyage by striking every sail. Go thou, mate, and have them secure the spritsail yard. Then take thy station on the forecastle." For an hour or two the old Rose of Devon went plunging through the sea, and there was much loosing and lowering of sails. For a while then the wind scanted, so that there was hope that the storm had passed, and during the lull they bent and set the new foresail, and must needs brace and veer and haul aft. But ere long the gale blew up amain, and in the late afternoon Captain Candle, sniffing the breeze, called upon all to stand by, and once more to hand both foresail and mainsail. Cast off the topsail sheets, clew garnets, leech lines, and bontlines. The order came thinly through the roar of the wind. "Yea, yea," a shrill voice piped. "Stand by the sheet and brace. Come lower the yard and furl the sail. See that your main halyards be clear, and all the rest of your gear clear and cast off." "It is all clear." "Lower the mainyard. Haul down upon your downhaul." As the yards swayed down, and the men belayed and halyards, 1 minute staggering to keep their feet, and the next minute slipping and sliding across the decks, the captain's sharp voice, holding them at their work, cut through the gale. "Haul up the clew garnets, lift leeching lines and buntlines. Come, furl the sail fast, and secure that yard, lest it traverses and gall." 'Twas a fierce gust. An old sailor cried to Phil, who had reached for the rigging and saved himself from going down to the lee scuppers. "We best look, the guns be all fast. I mind in the Grace and Mary, my second voyage, a gun burst into breechings." "Belay the fore downhaul," the mate thundered, and leaving his tale untold, the old man went crawling forward. The men heard faintly the orders to the helmsman. "Hard aweather, right your helm. Now port, port hard. More hands. He cannot put up the helm." Then out of the turmoil and confusion a great voice cried, "A sail, a sail!" "Where?" "Fair by us." "How stands she?" "To the north'ard." She lay close-hauled by the wind, and as the Rose of Devon scudded before the sea, bore down the wind and upon her, she hove out signs to speak. But though Captain Candle passed under her lee, as near as he dared venture, and learned by lusty shouting that she was an English ship from the East Indies, which begged the Rose of Devon, for God's sake, to spare them some provisions, since they were 80 persons on board who were ready to perish for food and water. The sea ran so high that neither the one vessel nor the other dared hoist out a boat, and parting, the men of the Rose of Devon lost sight of her in the gathering dusk. Still more and more the storm increased. Darkness came, but there was no rest at sea that night. Thanks to the storm and the labor and anxiety it brought all hands, Martin, the latter part of that day, escaped the duties of the ship's lyre, and glad was he of the chance to slip unobserved about the deck, with no reminder of his late humiliation. But by night he was blue with the cold, and drenching wet, and so hungry that he gnawed on a bit of biscuit when he needed both hands to haul on a rope. Finding Phil Marsham at his shoulder, and still resenting bitterly the jest to which he had fallen victim, he shot at him an ill-tempered glance, and in sullen silence turned his back. Belay! A line of struggling men tipped and stumbled as they secured the rope and went swaying and staggering across the deck when the ship rolled, for the weight of her towering superstructure and her cannon would set her wallowing fearfully in the merest seaway. One caught up the rope's end in loose coils. Another, having fallen, got clumsily on his feet and staunched his bleeding nose, the rest shivering as the icy wind struck through their wet shirts. Martin again turned his back on the boatswain and hugged himself, but to little profit. Although his fat arms covered a goodly area, Phil laughed softly at Martin's show of spleen, and was about to warm the man's temper further by a thrust well calculated to stir him to fury, when the ship rose with an odd lurch and descended into a veritable gulf. They saw above them a sea looming like a black cloud. It mounted slowly up, hung over them, curled down a dark tongue of water, and before the Rose of Devon had righted from her plunge into the trough, broke upon the ship and overwhelmed her. The waist was flooded from the head of the forecastle to the break of the poop. Water licking across the quarterdeck rose in a great wave that drenched the captain to his thighs and poured into the steerage room, momentarily blinding the men at the helm. For in those old ships they stood with their faces on a level with the quarterdeck, and following whip, staff, and tiller, spilled into the main deck and hold. Phil Marsham, as the water washed him off his feet, made shift to lay hands on the shrouds, and though he had no footing and was washed far out over the side, his grasp was strong, and he held himself against the rush of the water as the ship rose like a dog shaking its head and coming up through a wave. In very truth, she seemed to shake her head and struggle up to the black night above. But as Phil saved himself, he saw Martin cowering by a gun and striving to reach the breaching, and as the ship rose, the lad half felt, half saw, some great body washed past him and over the side. There was no one beside the gun. Martin was gone. Though a man were a knave and a liar, Phil Marsham had no stomach to see him drown thus. And though he held old Martin in contempt and bedeviled him night and day, yet he had a curious liking for the fellow. Overhead there hung from the maintop a loose rope. He faintly saw it swinging against the black sky. By a nimble leap there was a fair chance a man might reach it, and if he did not part, an active man might by a stroke of fortune regain the ship. All this Phil saw in the falling of a single grain of sand, and then the rope swung within reach of his hand, and he seized it. Spared the hazard of leaping for it, he let go the shrouds and swung with all his strength out into the night. Swinging high over the sea, he saw for an instant, while he was in mid-air, the Rose of Devon surging away from under him. The single great lantern was burning on her poop, and the dim lights of forecastle and cabin showed that those parts of the ship, at least, had come up through the sea unflooded. He thought he saw a cloaked figure, like a shadow, on the quarter-deck. Then he slid down into the darkness till the rope burned his hands. Then he struck the water and went under, gasping at the shock, for the sea was as cold as a mountain stream. He caught at last glimpse of the great ship, now looming high above him, and then clutching fast the rope with one hand and wildly kicking out, he felt with his knees what might be a man's body. With his free hand he reached for the body. He snatched at an arm and missed it, and then felt hair brushing his fingers and tangled them in it and gripped it. He went down and down, and then the drag of the water, for the ship was scudding fast, raised him to the surface. The ship rolled towards him, and he again went under, overshadowed by the lofty poop, which leaned out so far that, notwithstanding the tumble home, he thought the poop would come down and crush him. The ship then rolled away from him, and the rope brought up on his arm so hard that he feared the bones would pull from their sockets. But if he died in doing it, he was bound that he would hold the rope and keep his man. The ship rolled till he bumped against her side and was lifted half out of the water. "Help!" he cried. "Help, or we die!" He heard voices above and felt the rope move, as if someone had seized it, and then the looming bulk of the ship rolled back and drove him again down into the sea. He had no wind left for calling when he came up, as once more the ship rolled, but the man he held had come to life and was clinging like a leech to the rope, which vastly lightened the strain, and someone above was hauling on it. For a moment the two swung in air with the sea beneath them, and the ship rolled further, and their weight rested on planks, and hands from within the ship reached down and lifted them on board. The man, and it was indeed Martin, coughed like one who is deathly sick, as well as he might be, and went rolled down the deck with a boy to help him. But Phil, having kept his head and having swallowed no great quantity of sea-water, was able to, after breathing deeply a few times, to stand alone beside Will Canty, whose hands had drawn him to safety, and to perceive that waist, boat, capstan, windlass, and sheet anchor were washed away. He then heard a pounding and shouting aft. "What hath befallen us?" he demanded. "'Tis even worse than doth appear," Will cried. "The sea hath a free passage onto the hold between the timber heads. They are pumping with both pumps. The captain hath ordered the mizzen mast cut away, and the better to keep us before the wind. Hear ye not the sound of axes?" And out of the darkness burst the mate. "Come, my hearts, below there, cram blankets and hammocks into the leak, yea, the shirts from your own back, and then to pump, to take your turn, and pray Almighty God to give us sight of another day." There was running on the deck, and shadows passed forward and aft. From the quarter-deck a clear voice, so sharp that it pierced the noise of the storm, was calling, "Port the helm! Ease her, ease her! Now up, hard up! Ease her, ease her!" As the boatswain dropped through the hatch, he saw very dimly the captain crouching under the poop, his cloak drawn close about him. There was wild confusion below, for as the ship rolled to starboard, the sea burst in through the great gap along the timber heads, and pushed through the gap and into the ship the blankets and rugs that were stuffed in place. Though the men leaped after them, and came scrambling back to force them again into place between the timbers. And though they tore down hammocks and jammed them with the blankets to fill the great opening, yet as the ship again rolled and the sea once more came surging against the barrier, they again fled before it, and again the sea cleared the gap and came flooding in upon the deck. It was a sight to fill a brave man with despair. The more hands made faster work, and though the labor seemed spent in vain, they stuffed the gap anew. But now, when the ship again rolled to starboard, an old seaman raised his hand and roared, "Every man to his place, and hold against the sea. Stay, hold fast your ground. Come, bullies, hold hard. Good fellows, see, we have won." They had perceived his meaning, and braced themselves. With their hands they had held the stuffing in the gap until the pressure ceased, which was more of a feat than a man might think, since despite their every effort the sea had found passage in great strong streams. Yet they held to the last, and when the ship rolled back, Boatswain Marsham cried out, "Now, Master Carpenter, quick! Bring great nails and hammer, and a plank or two." "Yar, yar!" "Yea, yea," the carpenter cried, and came running down the deck. The men held the planking, and the carpenter drove home the nails, and thus they made the plank fast along the timbers behind the gap, where it would serve to brace the stuffing. Between the plank and the stuffing they forced a great mass of other wadding, and though the ship rolled over so deep and plank held against the sea, they left it so. But all that night, which seemed as long as any night they had ever seen, no man slept in the Rose of Devon, for they still feared lest the sea should batter away the plank and work their undoing. All night long they kept the pumps going, and all night long they feared their labor would be lost. But at 4 in the morning one of the pumps sucked, which gave them vast comfort, and at daybreak they gave thanks to God, who had kept them safe until dawn. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, and Phil and Martin met at sunrise. "Since thou hast hauled me out of the sea by the hair of my head," quoth Martin, "after the manner of one who swallows a grievance he can ill stomach, I must e'en give thee good morrow." And we will continue this story next Friday or Saturday. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.